Cool.
All right, so a big round of applause, please, for Chad.
Hey. Hi, how's everyone doing? Well, first, I'm grateful to be here. Thanks to Neil and Sean and Jan and, man, everybody. Ed, these guys really do a nice job for all of us, so I'm grateful to be here with all you smart, interesting people. I'm going to talk about some insights from live and simulated incident response, which means I have been running simulations in different contexts for quite a long time. Before I dive into that, I have a little bit of housekeeping. Kelly Shortridge is my collaborator in this. She's a brilliant woman. If you have a chance to check her out, please do. It's worthwhile. She built an excellent presentation on resilience for the public sector called the Red Pill of Resilience, and that's definitely worth looking into. After I introduce myself really quick, this is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the elephant in the room. I'll leave a little bit of mystery about that. I'm going to define what resilience is, because this is a little bit different than traditional cybersecurity or information security as we've thought about it. It's a little bit of a shift in how we think about this stuff. Incident response, that means something different to everyone, so we're going to define what I'm talking about when I say those two words. And then we're going to get to the insights in three different contexts: people, process, and technology, which is kind of a nice way of delineating this really huge thing. And then I'll have some parting thoughts for you. So my name is Chad Calease. I'm the cyber resilience lead for two companies. Whimsical is more focused on the offensive side in regulated industry, niche industries, energy, transportation, healthcare, financial services, stuff like that. And then Forget Computers Limited is an MSP, a Mac-based MSP in Chicago. They're awesome. They've been around for 20 years. They've been the leader in around that region. And so I work closely with them in mostly defensive sort of capacity. And it's, you need both of these, right? When I talk about resilience, we've always thought about it as defense, prevention, compliance, governance, all those good things. We still believe in those, and we want to forward those concepts. But we're going to take it a little bit of a step further. My whole scene I started doing simulations and making lots of mistakes in that back in the old days. I was designing and building web-based curriculum for high-functioning autistic students at a small school on Mercer Island funded by Paul Allen, RIP. And these kids, as you can imagine, kids are brutal. They will tell you if what you're doing is working or not. And I learned a great deal from these kids, trying to compel them to work up to their capacities. Right? They hired me at the school not because I'm trained in education, but because I have a lot in common with those kids. A little solidarity for you neurodiverse people out there. So I learned so much from trying to build learning environments and experiences for these kids that compelled them to work up to their capacity so we could measure their capabilities. Right? So if you can believe it or not, stick figures and plugging stick figures, teaching them to draw stick figures, and plugging that into like a really simple JavaScript routine that'll generate 3-pane comics, you can do a lot of assessment and comprehension with something as simple as that. So that was really the very beginning of my fascination and love for simulation and learning to really fail at it really well. I moved to Juneau shortly, a few years later, in 2000, and worked on a technical operations team across the state, building mostly infrastructure, less education focus for sure. Built a lot of infrastructures that had to be resilient because Alaska is full of kooks. The women in Alaska even have a saying that the odds are good, but the goods are odd. And we had to build everything that was secure because we couldn't always be on site. There would sometimes be months in between on-site visits, so we had to make sure there were secondary, tertiary systems for everything. And so security. And there's a lot of smart people in Alaska. They just like to tinker with stuff, and it would break our canopy mesh back to back, point to point architectures, and we had to make sure that things could at least continue to work until we could be there again physically. So when I came back to the lower 48 in 2006, I moved to Minneapolis, this town I'd always wanted to live in. I found myself working for a big advertising company, building web architectures for brands we all know and love, or hate, as the case may be, and I was building that same resilience into those systems, and this is 2006. Nobody cared about security or high availability much yet, so my bosses loved the kinds of things that I was doing. It didn't last very long, unfortunately, because they pulled me out of engineering into the creative group after just less than a year, because I love talking to different people and making really complicated stuff friendly for diverse audiences. So they put me client-facing, and that changed the course of my career a little bit. And by 2007, remember, iPhone came out, and that was the very kind of beginning of a mass exodus from a brand-focused, design perspective to a more audience-centric approach. We'll revisit this a little bit later, but this validated a lot of the things that I had learned in building things for lots of different specialized audiences, that if I'm not listening to them and I'm not connecting with what is valuable to them, and I don't validate that, then what I'm building isn't friendly for them. So it compromises the usefulness and long-term viability of solutions. So while I was grateful that this had happened, I was also kind of frustrated that this couldn't have been the first time anybody had been building things that were audience-centric, right? But I was very grateful. Steve Jobs said something that probably resonates with a lot of us, is that it's about connecting the dots backwards. Remember that? When he gave that speech at Stanford, was that 2004 or something? I thought that was really smart, something I can use in my life. I may not be the next, icon technology, but I can use that, connecting the dots backwards, to deliver value to my clients today. So I'm going to talk about the elephant in the room really quick. And the reason I need to talk about the elephant in the room, which is the 5 stages of grief. I don't know if anybody's ever seen this. This is the Kubler-Ross model. It's nice and linear, which isn't necessarily how grief works. But we have to talk about this. We're talking about security, so I think it's really important because we're all grieving because of this. We're not really talking about it. We're all processing this on our own level. Ourselves, our clients, our team members. And unfortunately, it does go a little something like this. Right? It's easy for us to justify a lot of our decisions, whether it's budget or process or people or any repeatable action that we do in the context of security. Generally, it's an afterthought. This is a big reason why. We like to blame people. It's human. When things happen, our clients like to blame us, like to find someone accountable. Politics, right? Someone always has to be accountable and to blame. This is a good one, right? It's a lot of myths in our grief, that it would be easier just to pay for a breach. But those of us that have actually been through it can guarantee you that that's not true. Nihilism has never been an answer to anything, but that's not an uncommon point of view for some of the folks that we know and work with day to day. It's not a straight line. We're all in various stages of this, and a lot of those stages and our progress through that seems to have a lot to do with our fluency and just our awareness of the real issues. Right? So the more we can educate each other and empower each other, the faster we're going to get to this. And this is a really important component of what we're going to talk about today, a really important component of resilience versus the traditional model of cybersecurity. Because a lack of it is what's, they're making money off of our worry. Right? They're selling us another blinky box here and another this, another that, and that's cool, but it's just adding more complexity, more fragmentation, and making our jobs much more difficult, especially when it comes to incident response. Because a key component of incident response is understanding our environment. If our environments are growing in complexity, we didn't understand it to begin with, that's not really working towards the outcome that we want. So when we say cybersecurity, right, when we introduce somebody to an idea or a concept, we're not feeling particularly good about it, they're always going to have a little bit of a residual negativity about that thing, right? And you say cybersecurity, I don't care where you say it. It sucks all the air out of the room, right? Conference rooms, dining rooms, coffee shops. But when we shift, when we introduce people to new concepts and new ideas in the sunshine, that's a very different experience. Not only is it very different for us as practitioners and solutions providers, but it makes people feel empowered, and then we can ask even more of them than we did before. This is the experience we've delivered over the last 20 years in cybersecurity. It's a lot of complexity. Anybody have an aunt and uncle that, or grandma, grandpa, mom, dad that has this? Sure, right? And this hasn't worked. Adding complexity and lots of jargon and making this not very friendly hasn't really worked. And so resilience is really about a presentation in a way that when we do this for somebody, right? If my uncle's like, oh, I just want to watch a VHS. Could you just make this thing do this thing? I don't try to explain to him what this all means. I just give him that. I empower him. I build a solution that is valuable to him, values what he's trying to do as a goal, right? He could be a business leader. Business leaders are just trying to build their business. They're trying to focus on a handful of things that they're really good at. They're not complete morons, right? So this, I also think of this as kind of user shaming. We've worked against ourselves in the security industry because we like to shame users and we like when we just give this to Uncle, we don't try to educate him about all the things that we did to make it work. We just give him this thing, and man, he's grateful. Feels good. Keep that in mind, because this is the core of a mind shift in delivering these kinds of services to people, because we really need people to find these things to be friendly. OPSEC, Operation Sec, as we call it, passwords and user actions and things, if they're not friendly, and I'd say if they're not invisible, they fail. Right? We've tried to make people do things. If it's not friendly, man, we're wasting our time. So let's talk about resilience for just a second. This is not a new idea, right? But when we say that word, I think about kids. I think about a lot of things that aren't so negative. It's a pretty empowering kind of idea. It's not a new word. It's been around for a long time. And I like how it rolls off the tongue, even in Latin. It's kind of cool. Makes people feel a little bit different than saying cybersecurity. It showed up in engineering cultures in the mid-late 19th century. And if you don't know what ductility is, that means like the kind of tensile strength of things, right? Fences and wires and things, that how much bending or stress they will take before they break. It was the first that this showed up, at least in our culture, in our language. In the 20th century, it started trickling down into ecology and urban planning and social sciences, right? Urban planning cities. I think there was an earthquake off the coast of New Zealand or in Christchurch, New Zealand, and they were like, maybe we should identify some places where we don't want to rebuild cities. That's probably a good idea, right? Probably a good idea for us to do that in IT systems as well, right? We don't want to rebuild something in the same, minefield where it existed before and recreate the same problems, right? So fortunately, this is starting to trickle now into technology, and a lot of different people are talking about this. This isn't just one person's great idea. This is something that is applying across sectors, across industries. Why it's not enough to just think about prevention and compliance and governance. Everybody's busy trying to wrap their minds around defining these things in friendlier ways to appeal and make sense and resonate to larger and larger and more diverse audiences. But there's a component of this that's been missing all along, which is the cultural component, the people component, and that's kind of where I come in. There's a lot of cool things that work in technology. If something doesn't work in the technology, it's my fault. It's pretty black and white. I didn't understand it before I deployed it, how it would interact with a larger, more complex system. But the human economics is arguably more important to understand. And so that's what's not being left out of these new approaches. Once we can get to this point, we can start having real conversations about threats, about what building a strategy around those threats, being prepared, expecting those threats, because our information's out there, everybody, right? It's just a matter of time before we have to respond to those situations. And being able to respond in a strategically confident and accurate way is very valuable to all of us, not just our clients. That's the goal of resilience, is to accept this situation and prepare for it. And the three biggest things are, of course, it's easier to talk about this, another thing to do it, but we'll talk a little bit about that, what that looks like. there's these three pieces that are pretty important: robustness, adaptability, and transformability. Robustness is often confused for resilience. We think if we have these really strong defenses, we're good, right? We engineer resilience for resilience sake. We have robust defenses. That, it could be IDS, some intrusion detection systems. It could be awareness training. It could be these really robust programs. We think as long as we have these variety of solutions, we're good. But the problem with that is there's a happy medium somewhere. Right? That diversity gives us strength. It does strengthen our resilience. But you get to a point where there's so much diversity and so much complexity, it starts to erode that resilience. And maybe you can understand what I mean. If we don't want to have everything centralized, maybe, because then that's a single point of failure. Right? But if we have more than one single point of failure and more and more and more and more and more, then we've got all these things to manage. So there's a happy medium somewhere. So when I say robustness, that's really the context that I'm talking about. Adaptability, we have to build this uncertainty into our strategy. I failed so many times when I first started doing this work where I love predictive models as much as the next person. And I love to build my threat models and my response plans around friendly situations that worked before, or situations about a network that were true at one point in time, maybe not today, but they were at another point. We have to build this uncertainty into our strategy. And transformability, I forgot in a lot of cases that this is the hardest part. This is the cultural part. It's easy to plan processes and choose technologies. That's the easy part. But then creating value in it for the audiences that we serve, much more challenging. And I'll talk about some of the ways that I've definitely screwed those things up. So where does incident response fit into all this? Incident response is across all of these. Right? When we have to respond to a breach, it could be an insider threat, it could be malware, it could be a social engineering attack, it could be any snowflakey thing, right? But no two ever look the same. They're very different. And so building simulations is challenging because it's a cultural thing too, right? There's no one-size-fits-all type of simulation that fits all of these. And this is what I mean by incident response, by the way. Let's define that. This is when something happens, the work that begins. There's several tracks that start all at once. We have the insurance track, the legal track, the technical track, the communication track, internal and external. Right? So all of those things start happening all at once. What are the first steps that we take as a team? What's the first phone call we make? If the three of us are on a team, what's the first thing that we do to make sure that we're not stomping all over forensic evidence by wiping a machine and getting it back up into production? So these are the kinds of things we're going to talk about a little bit. Because when they happen, we don't want to be in the midst of a situation where we're figuring all that out. We want to go through the simulation of these exercises first so that we have some fluency and we're not running around insane, grabbing at straws, trying to make sense of it, to be able to communicate with different people who are going to demand answers sooner than later. And with GDPR and a lot of other data protection and privacy laws coming down the pipeline, this response time is pretty important because it could make the difference of having to, the Uber breach, for example, back in 2016, what do they pay, like 2.3% of their revenue? If our clients end up paying 2.3% of their revenue, they're not going to be our clients for much longer, right? So these 72-hour response times, for example, in a GDPR situation, we've got 72 hours to notify affected parties in a situation like this. So we need to be able to have those conversations quickly because we can't do it without a plan or without some kind of fluency. And insurance companies aren't going to honor claims willy-nilly like they have over the past 15 years. That model is already starting to change. They're making requirements stricter. They're making it more challenging for business leaders to recover the damages that are caused by incidents. And this is concerning. I'm not going to drown you guys in stats, but this is an important one because less than a quarter of the SMB sector even has one. And only about a third of the folks that have one have any faith in it when something happens. And that's not awesome. That's where we can add a lot of value and make those things friendlier. And I have made so many mistakes over the years when I first got into this kind of work. I was the one who took the fall for a lack of planning and awareness. When I first set out to build solid incident response strategy, I failed because I focused on this. It was easy because I could control it. I could gather all of this concrete data about networks, about VLAN architecture, about infrastructure, all those kinds of things, and I forgot about the qualitative components, how people use the technology, which is arguably exponentially more valuable, especially in an incident response scenario. You can imagine if Julie is the only one who understands how a certain workflow goes, it's not documented and it's all in her head, and Julie's on vacation and incident response happens, well, guess who's going to take the fall for that? I made a lot of mistakes about that, thinking that this wasn't very valuable. So several years ago, I made a few lists. I like to make lists. And this particular list was the implicit versus explicit value that I bring to teams. And over the last 15 years, almost all the hidden value had to do with incident response. Right? Nobody else was thinking about it, so I could sleep better at night, I started making these strategies. And just like way back on Mercer Island in the 90s, I found that simulations is really the only way that I can bring any value to people to help them understand first the value of it and be able to share with them, like I'm trying to share with you today, some of the things that I learned through my own mistakes. And I divided them into buckets. So we're going to start with people, because people are the most important component of all of these things. We'll start here. I failed whenever I neglected the indisputable fact that others' mental models of technology is different from my own. No one probably understands technology as profoundly as all of you and your family, but it's easy for us to presume that they do. Or it's easier for us to talk to them when we do. Regardless of background or discipline or ability level, simulations are very valuable. They're powerful tools for diverse audiences because, number one, there's low stakes. There's not a whole lot at risk other than maybe a little bit of pride when we're doing a simulation, right? We can get past that, right, pretty quickly if we deliver these kinds of exercises in a friendly way. You guys remember back in August, there was that fellow, Richard Russell, who commandeered that Alaska Air A400? Remember that? And he did some loop-de-loops and some pretty crazy stuff before it didn't end very well. But it's a great example of the power of simulations because somewhere, if you guys listen to the audio of that flight, he made a joke with the air traffic controller that, I've played some video games. I know how to fly this thing. And so simulations have been really at the kind of the forefront of a lot of my thinking over the years. And when I hear stories like that, it really validates on a maybe a somewhat morbid but very real level that these things have an incredible amount of value. And building confidence and trust may arguably be the most valuable of these three. Because if we can't do that, and I have failed miserably at establishing confidence and trust before I embarked on these exercises. And when we talk about these kinds of exercises, simulations, this is what I'm talking about. So the tabletop, right, where we sit around a table, literally, and we say, okay, well, what happens to Marcos's account if that's compromised? What are some of the really bad things that could happen? And we sit around and we talk about some of the things that Marcos's account has access to. And we imagine nightmare scenarios, and we walk through that. And it's fun, because the people say, oh, let's do Marsha next. And gives them some ownership in it. Right? Live exercises, I've done probably a couple hundred live exercises. I've done thousands of tabletop exercises. They're much more friendly, as you can imagine, where people say yes to them. The live exercises that's tough, and it puts them on the spot because there's planned and there's unplanned live exercises. Right? You put something screwy on a layer 2 switch or something and let people try to sleuth that out. And then, of course, phishing. Some of you have already done this, right? You have to be very careful with phishing exercises in the context of confidence and trust because it's easy to destroy. It's much easier to destroy confidence and trust with a phishing exercise because people feel that their privacy and their whole person, their character has been assassinated through a phishing attack. Right? That was a training exercise, right? But it's important for us to put ourselves in the shoes of our audience and how those things are perceived aren't always the same mental model as we are. So my personal recommendation is, if you're going to do phishing exercises, that's cool. Just be careful, because I've seen them cause more harm than good. I can't just, recommend some simulations, right? Do this simulation, because I made that mistake early too. I had some success with some simulations in the last 10 years and tried to bend those simulations to every organization, and that failed miserably. So I have to say that, start in an organization, because it's probably the most commonly overlooked type of threat. And an insider threat could also be an outsider with insider credentials. So keep that in mind. That's a good starting place when we're thinking about, at least that's not a starting place I had. I made a lot of mistakes in trying to bend these exercises to every single culture that I was working with. I thought I knew more than I did. I thought I had to transmit this perception of knowing everything, which I also failed in doing that because it cut me out of a lot of collaboration with the team that I was working with. It cut me out of a lot of learning opportunities because I had to have this persona of knowing everything instead of saying, oh, I don't know, let's learn that, let's figure that out together, let's test that. That trust and confidence piece, right? So, and predictive models and people, humans, we like to blame people. Hey, thanks, Sean. We like to blame people. When something happens and we have to call a client and say, you've been impacted by this breach, the first thing they say is, how dare you? This is your fault. We're going somewhere else. Who knows? It's bad. Right? But when we invite clients to our tabletop exercise, they may have some questions. They may be like, why are we here? What is this all about? Why do we have to do this? But a half an hour later, they walk out of there like, huh, interesting. And then when a breach happens and we call them and we say, this happened, can you imagine how their response is different? They say, oh, that's so unfortunate that happened to you guys. How unfair. Good thing we did a tabletop exercise. You guys were really thinking about this. Completely different response. So there's a lot of reasons, even competitively, as a competitive advantage. Right? I have clients that brag about this. And they win clients that other companies that do similar things won't get because they use this as a differentiator. That this is a commitment, this is something we do. Makes those clients feel a little more confident about getting into cahoots with them. So there's a lot of value in being transparent about these exercises, and I didn't recognize that. I made that mistake a lot. So don't be like me. No. Inclusion. Invite people. Invite office administrators. Those people know a lot about workflows. You might think you invite the CTO or invite, those guys are important too, right? But invite the gals, girls, elderly ladies, invite them all because they all have a piece of the puzzle. And this is why. Vendors, partners, they all have pieces of that puzzle, right? And we tend to kind of sidestep a lot of that to make things easy. I made that mistake a lot. Don't raise your hand if you try to do everything yourself. That's what I thought. Documentation is really important. We all try to find ways to demonstrate that value. This is another great mistake that I made was I would create all this great documentation, especially early, 10, 12 years ago, this great documentation. I wouldn't show it to anybody. It would live in the dark somewhere. Make sure to find an opportunity to share that because that can create business cases for new budgets and lots of good reasons and helps us make decisions about the right tools. And I often made that mistake. Let's talk about process a little bit. This is important too. We have the people and process are kind of part of the, I keep them in the same room in my mind, right? But I failed by focusing too much on the attack or the incident itself, trying to define that. I spent a lot more of my efforts describing how it happened rather than the potential consequences of it. And so I can't understate or overstate this enough to you is when you find yourself in a position of having to communicate about an incident, less is more. You'll get to it. Your first job, our first job that we can is notifying affected parties. And the details, we don't want to over-promise things, and we don't want to understate two things because we will catch hell for either one of those. So this was a lesson I learned the hard way. I made a lot of mistakes about not using restraint, thinking, jumping to a lot of conclusions. Wait and get the whole story. I still have to remind myself, wait and get the whole story. And I like to move fast. I really do. I like to solve 6 things at once, and that's not always the best in these situations because tensions are high, right? Rumors are spreading like crazy internally, especially if there isn't an IR plan, right? People will like to blame leadership and create a lot of discord in the midst of all of that. And so having a few templated communications to internal and external parties ahead of time, this is something that these simulations uncover almost in every case, is that our teams don't think about this. They're trying to build these communications in the midst of an incident, as if it's not stressful enough, right? That's a good one. I talked a lot. I would ask good questions, but I didn't listen to the answers. And even when I listened to the answers, I didn't document them properly, which would leave me a day or 2 days later improvising those answers, which we can get away with in some contexts. But in this one, it's pretty critical that we have a very high attention to detail, especially about specific workflows. So I have learned that lesson the hard way, I'm afraid. This works, guys. I mean, it doesn't really matter who we're dealing with, the CFO or someone who brings the mail in every day, because physical security is also a concern. Right? We want to stop for a moment and say this is important in the digital world, but we also have physical security concerns in my line especially, and physical security is often overlooked. So thinking about listening and validating all the people involved in our culture, I overlooked and made that mistake much more than once. Sharing. You can imagine, I often made the mistake of making it through something like that and then just kind of being in a hurry to get on with business as usual. Postmortems are incredibly valuable because it uncovers, we don't want to return to a current state. There is no such thing. After a breach, there's no current state. There's only future state. So I overlooked that. I didn't define that very well. And share those triumphs and failures. You can understand a lot of companies want to be discreet about the failures in particular. They may talk about the triumphs. Even talks like this, we hear a lot of people say, do this, do this, do this. People generally don't say, this is how I screwed up. But we learn more from the failures, arguably, than we do the triumphs. Sometimes the triumphs is just, we got lucky, especially in this context. We don't know how things are going to fail. They don't fail in predictable ways all the time. So share those things, right? Those are opportunities. And they can also help spread awareness, which, as you can imagine, is a big component of my own model success, is really just making sure people start to shape their mental model in a way that includes security and resilience. This value, it can't be understated. Right? We talked about this a little bit already, but I like to reiterate it because good documentation can include a failure. Right? A piece of documentation about a specific failure is incredibly valuable, and it creates confidence and trust. Because let's face it, the non-technical folks love it when we screw up. But it opens a door. And I think it's a door that we don't often walk through enough. So that's worth mentioning. I made that mistake dozens of times. Last but not least, the technology, right? We got to understand our stuff. And when we just have to unplug something because we don't know why it's broken or how to fix it, we stomp all over our forensic evidence. And that's tragic because there's a lot of moving pieces when an incident takes place that we have to consider. We have to consider all those different tracks. When I was just starting out as a systems and network administrator, when something happened, I did what I could do. I just shut everything down, pulled the plug, broke hardware, and software RAID mirrors, things like that. Wiped VMs, broke the mirror and respawned a VM, and got back into production. But I wiped out a heap of forensic evidence in the process, and that may have been okay 10 years ago, but that's not okay anymore. That's going to void our insurance claims. That's going to, some legal issues. And as these rules, especially here in California, right, we have some new legislation that's going live in 2020. You Californians know this better than I do. I hadn't taken the time and care to understand my environment the way I should have. I stomped all over evidence, and in an ever-evolving threat landscape, this isn't going to fly. I ignored logs. I would set up a syslog server, something really basic, and shuttle off some basic logging. Nothing verbose. Certainly not from layer 2, layer 3 devices. Certainly not endpoints. We can't piece together what happened if we don't have the pieces. So this could be a presentation in and of itself because I know syslog's not perfect. It certainly wasn't designed with security in mind, ironically. Here's this really poorly designed tool. We don't really have a replacement for it yet, so it still has value. I ignored it, and it cost me a lot of sleepless nights and tough conversations. We got to know where our logs are. The network piece is important. The endpoint piece is arguably more important. Malware, Patrick can probably speak to the importance of endpoint logs when we're trying to piece together a timeline, how something happened, where it started to traverse laterally across the network. Without these pieces, it's really hard to build those timelines. I made the mistake of building a threat model that was true at some point in time, but isn't necessarily true today or at that moment because it was easy. I would have to get my hands a little bit dirty to build a better threat model that sometimes involved talking to people. And if you don't know what a threat model is, we can spend a little bit of time talking about that. Threat models do these 5 basic things. If you have kids, Thomas and I were joking about this morning that I send the kids upstairs to read sometimes after dinner on their iPads and guided access. No, they haven't figured out how to defeat that yet, but they will, right? And that will soon become a part of my threat model. It's not right now because they're little. As they get older, my threat model is going to change, right? But determine the goals we have in regard to security for an app or a service, right? We got to identify those objectives. Surveying the system is important. These things don't have to take a lot of time. Right? I made that mistake. I thought there was way too much involved, and so that was easier for me to fall back on what had worked before. It's important to determine the components of the system, right? The routes that data travels. Trust boundaries, right? We have more and more federated systems today than we ever have. Even confederated systems, right? I mean, the mental models of someone that is used to a confederated model is very different from someone who's used to working with a federated model, right? By federated, I mean like maybe a identity and access management tool, right? A cloud-based authentication tool. The way that we think about the world is very different from someone who runs an Active Directory forest in the closet, right? Decomposing the system is important because that step determines the components of the system that have an effect on security, like the login module, for example, right? And then identifying the threats is tough, right? We imagine any potential outside threats that the system has, right? My twins defeating guided access mode, right? That's a potential threat. What could they do? They could buy a bunch of stuff on the App Store if I'm not paying attention. This generally focuses on the kinds of threats that are known. Right? There's always 0 days and things that we can't speak to until they happen, but there is a long list of things that we can otherwise be aware of. And last, we have to identify the vulnerabilities that exist, right? Consider identified threats and determine if the system's weak in those areas. It's work, but it's work that I ignored and paid the price for in a lot of ways. These are some frameworks. There's a lot of frameworks. I mean, I didn't list attack here, but attack is, I've made a couple pals from MITRE in the past few weeks. There are a lot of frameworks out there that already exist that can help us do those things less painfully. I acquiesce to a lot of third parties, vendors, partners, because I just wanted to take the path of least resistance. I don't do that anymore. I build third-party risk matrices, and I make sure that my clients' partners and vendors are aware not only of our commitment, but of the potential threats to them. And that kind of goes back to a philosophical approach. When I first started on all this, I made the mistake of thinking that if I brought value and tools to people in the corporate environments, that they would bring those tools home and find value in them as individuals. That did not work. And I kept expecting a different outcome for many years doing that until I accepted the fact that I have to deliver those tools and those strategies to people on an individual level, help them protect themselves and their families and their friends, and then that informs the kinds of decisions and choices that they make at work. It doesn't really work the other way around. So until I accepted the fact that I have to work with people on an individual level and transmit that value in that context at first, it goes back to kind of the trust and confidence piece, right? But it helps with building accountability with these third parties. It's the same thing. I didn't realize I made the mistake of imagining everybody thought about the cloud the same way I do. These mental models are not the same. We take that for granted. I have to be constantly reminding myself that on-prem folks that insist, that are still resisting the cloud, their perception and the definitions and their priorities, how they prioritize those definitions is very different than my own. I have to go about those conversations with a lot of intention if I'm going to expect them to be on board and be able to build a strategy that's friendly, first of all, that people can understand, and that has value for a diverse audience. Because it can't just have value for a few people, which is what I thought when I started all this. I thought if I build a strategy that has value for a few key people, that's all I need. And I failed in doing that over and over again. So there's 3 things I'd like to leave you with today, just to sum up. Resilience is acceptance of reality and building strategy around it. Incident response is a critical and overlooked component of resilience. And resilient incident response includes and validates a diverse audience of stakeholders. That is what I am hoping to transmit to you today through all of these mistakes that I have made. If I had access to these 3 things, I would have had them tattooed all over me in hopes that I would not have made so many mistakes. So how's my time? Sean? Great, okay, I'd be happy to. So here's some parting thoughts for you. I'm including some cool resources. These inspire me to build a lot of simulations. Right? I'm hesitant. I wouldn't say, do this simulation or this simulation. But there's some awesome resources in here when you get the deck that can inspire you to build your own simulations, because I can imagine you're sitting there with some ideas like this would be really cool. Even Thomas and I this morning were saying, hey, these cool near-field communications stickers, we could stick those under the tablecloth and somebody sets their phone on and that'd be like a cool exercise, cool simulation when those things pop up on our phones, because we got to get ready for that, right? Our phones are going to stop popping up crap, right? It's only a matter of time. So in here are some really great people doing really great work that have inspired me to build my tool set of simulations, both live. I don't include any phishing in here, right? If you guys have all hopefully experienced phishing simulations if you haven't conducted them. So I figured you got some of those tools. But this is kind of focused more on the live and tabletop exercises. I want to step back really quick. This is the last thing I want to leave you with. When I was at Omnicom in those days, when they pulled me out of the engineering group to the creative side, I started hanging out in their library. Have you guys ever been in creative agency libraries? They're not like anything I didn't even know these existed. And it seemed to me that all the things that Apple was doing around user experience and stuff is cool, but it couldn't have been it. This thing, like museums and Disney, and there's lots of people who've been building experiences around an audience for years. This couldn't have been the beginning of all that. So I had to learn and had to figure it out for myself that this had to have started somewhere further back. Right? There's a lot of examples, but one of the best ones is this one. Did you guys know that Heinz is the most trusted consumer packaged goods brand on the planet? And in '68, they listened to their audience and introduced this individual serving of ketchup that had never existed before. Right? And so at that point, the tomato ketchup industry was about 140 years old. This is the first time anybody innovated in 140 years. So in 1998, this company was tanking. You can Google all this stuff, right? I'm not making this up. And they had a new president. And he came in, William, leaves me at the moment, I'll check my notes. He came in, he said, hey, everybody's complaining about this bottle because they can't get the last bit of ketchup out of it. We got to do this. You think everybody was excited about that? No, man. They pushed back. They weren't able to introduce this until 2002. It took them 5 years of internal struggles to get all the designers and all the people involved with this one product, ketchup, to focus on an audience-centric approach. So how long do you think it's going to take us to shift? It's going to take a little while, right? A lot of pushback. So if we were to apply this, I was inspired by this, right? And this is one of the things that really inspired me to chase down some of the biggest challenges I could find. And you might argue that cybersecurity, information security, privacy are some of the biggest challenges in technology. That's probably why I gravitate towards these specific challenges. Because this is how we've been doing it the past 20 years. Embrace the attacker mindset. How do the bad guys think? What would they do, right? We still do this. I still, we focus on penetration testing and red team, offensive security. It's important, right? But it can't be the only mindset, right? What if we turn this upside down and started making things friendlier for people? The whole remote control analogy, right? What if we stopped trying to run a school and educate everybody on every little thing that we know and just delivered them a better experience, made it friendlier, less annoying? So in 2003, right, by this point, the ketchup industry was 170 years old, and Heinz innovated again, right? And in 2003 is about a year after it was introduced in 2002, and they had a lot of data at how much the ketchup industry had grown. It had grown by 2%, the whole industry. Heinz sales grew 6%. And the CEO said, companies sure can make a lot of money by making things less annoying. And so I want to leave you with that thought, because if it took Heinz years to get internal buy-in to redesign a bottle of ketchup, it's not going to be easy to do this in our field. But the better we all get at doing this, at listening, validating our audience, and making things less annoying for those audiences, the more successful our clients are going to be, and the more successful we're all going to be. So that's all I got. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Chad. Does anybody have a question for Chad? We do have a couple of minutes that we could spend in here answering questions.
Go ahead.
Oh, sure.
Hey, great talk. Thanks.
Thanks.
How do you build in resilience? I'm from a creative agency. How do you build in resilience when your industry is moving to cloud-based solutions that are completely destroying every hope of your existing containment fields, and your perimeter is getting pushed out? How do you bake in any kind of resilience when cloud companies are just destroying you?
Well, it's about uncertainty, right? So let's pick something. Let's pick a code repo, right? If you're using GitHub and suddenly that becomes unavailable, I encourage teams to build offline backups, just like anything else, right? If we're a victim of ransomware and we don't have an offline set of backup, an offline strategy for that, we don't really have a chance at resilience, right? So you could argue that if you're using, Leon was talking about the various cloud services and comparing them, right, with, G Suite and OneDrive, and OneDrive just gives you symbolic links, for example. So you literally have to pull down all this stuff, right, to keep an offline set of backups. We haven't gotten there yet. We're still in this, if I could back up a slide, we're still fighting against the upside down ketchup bottle. So we have to do things in this really kludgy way, but it has to be intentional. So you have to create an offline backup strategy, for example, right? If your critical files, if you're collaboratively editing, files in Premiere, for example, and you've got those all in one basket, that's a single point of failure. So we have to eliminate those single points of failure. And the only way to do that is through some kind of pain and suffering right now, because this mindset hasn't caught on yet. But it will, and it is. It's just going to take some time, right? So that's a really important question that you asked, is how do we build resilience into these workflows, right? How do we establish, even in a phishing scenario, as much as I'm kind of personally against that, I've seen it done well, where you don't have, for example, punitive punishment for that, right? Reward people. When they forward a phishing email to you, you don't even have to give them a gift card or something. Like, just send them an email in front of everybody and CC everybody in the whole, say, awesome job, man. Just validate that they're thinking about it. So it's cultural, right? You give people a tool, for example, to use encryption tools. So that way we minimize those risks to begin with. As creative agencies, we have some clients that are creative agencies, and one of the biggest challenges is segmentation, because they're all using a different tool set. So, getting everybody on board and saying, okay, well, these are sanctioned tools, these are not. And these sanctioned tools, these are acceptable ways, these are the definitions that we have defined for these, and these are the priorities. Please follow them. We won't get mad at you if you make mistakes as long as you follow them. If you don't follow them, then we're going to get mad at you and we're going to have problems, right? But that's the best you can do. And then just awareness. Validate them. It's just like having a puppy. If you're like hitting the puppy and doing all kinds of things that are somewhat barbaric, that puppy's not really going to love you, right? We build a foundation of that relationship based on trust, and it's a very simple thing, but I know it's easier said than done. But it's a cultural challenge, especially in creative agencies, because they don't like to. They know, right? They know, yeah.
Hey, Chad, when you're tabletopping at organizations like that,
yeah.
You mentioned invite as many people as you can,
That's
but
right.
obviously in a larger organization that could be impractical all
Yes.
at once. How would you recommend consultants go about organizing tabletop groups? Do you do it?
Groups
Number
of
of people?
15,
Okay.
yeah. Work really well. Anything more than that, it's kind of unwieldy.
And
But
which
creative,
people do you want to have in the room together?
you
in
want
those
to
groups
have
of
as
15?
diverse an audience as possible. I mean, you want to have creatives, designers, you want to have HR, you want to have account people, strategy, because a big piece of it, and we've had some success with this too, when we think about information security policy sets, right? We design those in our creative environments. We make one-pagers. They look like infographics. They don't look like information security policy sets at all. They're colorful. There's pictures, right? So we have to consider our audience, right? If we're trying to teach fish how to swim, it helps if we put them in the water. So that's an important consideration. So in that group of 15 people, make sure that there's allies, right? Don't invite just one designer, invite two so they can validate each other, right? It's a human thing, man. It's human economics. That works very well. And when they start riffing on the idea of what happens when Carl's account is compromised, they're a little bit more at ease, because then everyone's thinking about, oh, what happens if Lewis's account gets? Can we do Lewis next? Right? And they have some skin in the game. Right? So that's really important. It has to be a conversation. It's all about facilitation. Oh, and bring somebody to take notes. That was in one of my slides, but I don't think I actually emphasized that. I made that mistake a lot, where I didn't bring somebody to take notes. You lose a lot of intel. So find somebody to just come and take notes or record it, if you can have permission of everybody in the room, because that's valuable. And you can continue to refine and improve those simulations from that content. That's a good question. Yeah, how we time? One more, maybe one more. You had one in the back. You're being really patient.
Yeah, please.
With communication restraint, talking to the end users, I feel if you don't explain a situation, people feel patronized, but if you explain it too much, they're like, oh, the nerds are just doing their nerd thing.
Right.
How do you recommend handling communication to lay end users for a breach, or when you're performing, pretty vigorous administrative actions?
Sure. I talk about getting the whole story. I talk about getting the facts. I'd like to speculate. We do have some ideas, the team and I, but we don't want to give you guys any misinformation, because if you talk to other people, we want to make sure that you guys are informed, right? So we make it about making sure that we're giving them answers that they can rely on. And in this day and age, that's really easy, because we're getting a lot of mistruths in the media and politics, right? A lot of this is about fake news and fake, and there's a lot of contention about that. And so those conversations are much easier to have nowadays, right? When I have breaches, like a couple of breaches week before last, right, where we had to exercise restraint. and talk about facts, not speculation. Because speculation can come back and bite you in the butt really bad. When you try to downplay the scope of something before you have the whole story, or you try to speculate and say something's worse than it was, you're kind of in trouble either way. And so it's a diplomatic exercise. And that's why having templates ahead of time is incredibly valuable, because you can build a template that's kind of generally going to describe a breach in the context of your specific culture and your industry, right? If you have GDPR concerns, you have HIPAA, or you have PCI, whatever it is, you can speak to that in a way that's diplomatic, that's transparent, but, you know, still kind of holding some cards close before you know what they are. Yeah, that's an important question. Yeah? Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thank you so much, Chad. That was fantastic. Chad Calease, everybody. So.